The monitor that I've got behind me is, in my opinion, quite unique. It's called the AOC Gaming 27G2ZN3, and it sports a flat 27-inch VA panel with a resolution of 1080p or Full HD, and a refresh rate that goes up to 280Hz, making it ideal for hardcore competitive gamers. Furthermore, it supports adaptive sync technologies and also HDR. Better still, all of this comes in at just £190, at least at the time of filming and in the UK, making it super affordable. Now in this video that has been sponsored by the manufacturer, I'll be covering everything you need to know about it so you can make your own informed purchasing decision. Now to kick things off, I thought I should quickly touch upon connectivity, because here you've got a singular DisplayPort 1.4 input and two HDMI 2.0 ports. And here the DisplayPort input will allow you to output 1080p at 280Hz, thus the maximum refresh rate and resolution. However, HDMI will cap you at 240Hz at 1080p. Now the differences between 240 and 280Hz are negligible, but nonetheless it's just something I thought I should point out at the beginning of this video in case you are limited to HDMI, and therefore you will be capped at 240Hz due to the bandwidth limitations of the HDMI ports that are found on the monitor itself. So with that established, and with the monitor connected over DisplayPort to my RTX 3080 and running at 1080p at 280Hz, I went ahead and did my tests. Now first off, when it comes to its input lag, I had it objectively measured at just 0.8 milliseconds. And sure enough, it might not look as impressive in comparison to some of the other monitors that I've recently tested, but it is still a phenomenal figure. So much so that I would be happily using this monitor for hardcore competitive gaming, at least when it comes to its overall input lag. While playing a game such as Counter-Strike 2, I had no issues whatsoever when it came to registering my mouse inputs. Now I would also like to mention over here that this was clocked in with the low input lag mode enabled via the monitor's OSD. In fact, it was permanently grayed out. However, I did notice that when I did enable adaptive sync technologies, in other words AMD FreeSync or indeed NVIDIA G-Sync, where the latter is more applicable to me with my RTX 3080, I did notice that the input lag did slightly increase. I don't have an objective number for this, but subjectively I can say it did increase a little bit. Not so much so that it threw me off, but just something being mindful about. Now another important factor aside from input lag is the overall response time. And here are the different overdrive modes you can select via the monitor's OSD. You've got off, weak, medium and strong. There's also a boost mode which I'll be touching upon very shortly, and that is because it's in relation to motion blur reduction technologies. Now using the OSRTD tool with the overdrive set to off, you can see the average initial time towards the bottom left hand side of your screen clocking in at 6.27 milliseconds. Now in terms of the weak mode, this drops down to 5.2 milliseconds. However, the recommended mode, at least for me, was the medium preset, because this meant the average initial time sat at just 3.93 milliseconds, and the percent in window was sitting at 63%, which could have been a little bit higher, specifically at 280Hz. However, if you do look towards the middle of your screen, you'll be able to see that there is no RGB overshoot. In other words, no sort of purple trailing that occurs even on its medium overdrive mode. Now as we shift to the strongest mode preset, you can see now that there is a lot more RGB overshoot, in other words errors that are appearing on the screen, and this is denoted by red boxes. However, on the flip side, you do get a better average initial time, in other words a faster monitor, clocking in at just 2.29 milliseconds, which is actually pretty impressive. The percent in window also increases at 80% for a 280Hz refresh rate window. Now, I would also like to mention over here that if you were to run the monitor at 240Hz, I did also do some tests. On its medium preset, you can see over here that the average initial time sat at 4.55 milliseconds, but alas over here the percent in window dropped to 53%, which is quite disappointing. However, on its strongest mode overdrive at 240Hz, you can see that the average initial time sits at 3.55 milliseconds, while the percent in window sits at 70%, all while the RGB overshoot is pretty much minimal. So in other words, if you're going to be using this monitor at 240Hz, run it on the strongest mode overdrive, and if you're running it at 280Hz, run it on its medium overdrive setting. Now for me to give you a visual demonstration of this, you'll be able to see the UFO ghosting test, and indeed towards the lighter shades on the strongest mode overdrive at 280Hz, you'll be able to see some inverse ghosting, and there's some light shades, and this can be noticeable even when you're playing a game such as Counter-Strike 2, let alone more visually appealing games. So therefore, I would just suggest running the medium overdrive as I mentioned before, or indeed dialing out to 240Hz while running the strong mode overdrive instead. Now there is also some VA smearing, which you'll be able to hopefully notice via the UFO ghosting test. However, it's very much minimal. It didn't actually throw me off in the slightest, be it when it came to scrolling text and therefore reading different documents, or indeed while gaming. Now aside from all this, the monitor does also have motion blur reduction technologies, or MBR for short. This effectively gives you a clearer image and therefore might be something handy for certain gamers out there. Although the caveat over here is that it will limit the overall brightness. I'll be touching upon this further down in the video. However, when it comes to the overall motion clarity, you can see that the boost mode overdrive or the MBR 20 level mode do indeed give you a better, clearer image in comparison to not running MBR altogether. Now the boost mode overdrive effectively runs the strongest mode overdrive with the maximum MBR level, and therefore if you're running at 280Hz, I would actually not recommend running the boost mode overdrive, but rather going on the different MBR increments, and here you've got 20 to choose from. And thus, in the level 20 mode, I was able to run it with the medium overdrive setting. It's great to see that AOC has actually provided you the option, allowing you to essentially tailor the experience to what you like. Now similarly, it was also able to run at 240Hz, and yet again, just for the sake of comparison, I ran it on the medium overdrive. But again, over here, if you're running at 240Hz, you might want to go for the strong mode overdrive with MBR enabled. Now aside from the brightness limitations of MBR, it is also worth mentioning that it cannot be used simultaneously with adaptive sync technologies. Now this does actually perfectly bring me onto AMD FreeSync and also NVIDIA G-Sync. Now the monitor does not have a built-in G-Sync module, and therefore it has a VR range from 48 up to 280Hz, at least over a DisplayPort, and 48 up to 240Hz over HDMI. Now while connected over DisplayPort to my RTX 3080, I was able to fire up the NVIDIA Pendulum demo, and I did actually notice a little bit of flickering. It was not overly severe, and it didn't actually throw me off using NVIDIA G-Sync, but it's just something I thought I should note. Furthermore, I was able to run the monitor at 1080p at 280Hz with NVIDIA G-Sync and also HDR simultaneously running. Now the monitor's HDR experience is not something to really shout about. It hasn't got any sort of display HDR certifications, at least not from what I'm aware, and therefore it only has got a regular HDR10 compliance. This can be handy in certain scenarios, but frankly, if you do want some more control of your monitor, for example, to adjust the brightness, or indeed if you just want to adjust some of the other settings, you might just want to disable HDR given the monitor's limitations and simply run an SDR signal instead. As for console gamers, this might be quite handy, and in this respect, if you're going to be running it with a console, you will be pleased to know that it'll run 1080p at up to 120Hz. So with the gaming section out of the way, let's talk about the overall image quality. And as a reminder, it's got a flat 27-inch Full HD VA panel, and it's also got a matte coating to it. Now given the overall resolution and its form factor, it means it has got a lower PPI of 81.59 in comparison to those smaller 1080p monitors that run, for example, a 24.5 or, for example, a 25-inch form factor. So therefore it's just worth considering. In my case, I had no problems when it came to text legibility, and I didn't feel that the monitor was overly large when it came to running it at a 1080p resolution. But of course, your mileage may vary, and it's very much subjective. If you want some more information about pixel density and how it might affect productivity, make sure you check out the video up on your pop-up banner, or also check out the links down in the description below. Now with this monitor, you have got a dedicated sRGB mode, which you can select via the monitor's OSD. Now in said mode and using my calibrators, I noticed a gamut coverage of 86.6% and a gamut volume of 89.8%. You can see below how it compares to the sRGB standard. The average delta-E sat at a pretty impressive 1.47 and their maximum delta-E sat at just 3.47, and therefore means it can be used for some image editing work. Now as for the overall tested contrast ratio, it sat at a whopping 4,350 to 1, therefore completely blowing any sort of TN or IPS monitor out of the water. As for its measured white point, in comparison to 6,504 Kelvin target, it sits at 6,302 Kelvin at 100%, although I did notice at certain levels it did actually go pretty AWOL. Now as for its overall gamma curve, it sits relatively close to the 2.2 standard, although you can see towards the lighter shades that it does actually drop off. Now if you're not going to be editing any sort of images or video grading, you might want to unlock the wider color gamut of this monitor and therefore give a little bit of extra pop from your image. Now here there is a warm mode preset, which is the one I actually chose, and I then put it through its paces using my calibrators. Here you can see that the gamut coverage and gamut volume in the Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 color spaces have been positively affected. You can see below how it compares to the Adobe RGB standard, not to be confused with the sRGB standard that I talked about before. However, the overall average delta and the maximum delta sit at 3.95 and 12.9, so therefore you won't want to use it for any sort of image editing work in the Adobe RGB space. Its tested contrast ratio doesn't change, and as for its measured white point, it does slightly shift at 6527 Kelvin at 100%. Yet again, I noticed some of the anomalies at different levels of brightness. As for its gamma curve, it sits relatively close to the 2.2 standard, but it's just a little bit below what you might expect. Now, for those with a keen eye, you might have noticed the brightness figures, and yes indeed, in HDR or in SDR, I clocked in a peak of 293 nits, which is very close to the manufacturer's claim. This effectively means that you can use the monitor in a bright sunlit room, although it's just worth noting over here that you'll probably have to run it at 70 to 90% brightness on the vast majority of your usage, because it doesn't get overly bright, and therefore means that it does affect your overall HDR capabilities, as I did mention before. Its minimum brightness does get all the way down to 31 nits, which shows good sort of range. As for the boost mode preset or the MBR 20 level mode, it is indeed capped at 34 nits. If you do want some increased brightness with MBR, you might want to go for the different MBR level modes, and therefore means you'll get a little bit of extra brightness while still benefiting from motion blur reduction technologies. Very much on that notion, it brings me on to brightness uniformity. And here on my tested panel, it actually did a tremendous job across the board, which is pretty much impressive for a 27-inch panel. The same sort of comments could be said about the overall backlight bleed, which is pretty much non-existent. It should come as almost no surprise given it's a VA panel, but it's certainly great to see. And here, these images were taken in a completely pitch black room with the monitor's brightness set to roughly 80%. And therefore means that if you're going to be someone who's going to be gaming with a lot of dark scenes, or of course watching movies with a lot of dark scenes, then this VA panel might be better suited for you in comparison to an IPS alternative. With those tests out of the way, let's talk about its overall build quality. And here you've got a three-side borderless design with a relatively thin bottom bezel. You've also got a black and red theme that runs through it. The monitor stand is actually very adjustable. You've got height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments, therefore meaning that you can find a good sort of ergonomics. And given the overall price point of the monitor, it's great to see that AOC have not actually given you a fixed stand. Now, I would also like to mention, however, that if you do not like the built-in stand for any given reason, you can replace it with a VESA-compatible stand, therefore allowing you to place it on a monitor arm or a multi-monitor setup. Now, the monitor has not got any of those nonsensical RGB lights, which I'm all for. Instead, it has got that black and red finish, as I did mention before, towards the rear of the monitor. Now, if you do want to access the monitor's OSD, there's a few physical buttons found at the bottom right-hand side. They're a little bit hard to press, but once you get your head around it, you'll find a pretty comprehensively laid out OSD, which provides you all the right options that you'll require. Now, if you do notice via the monitor's OSD, there is a volume setting. However, it's worth noting over here that the monitor has not got any sort of built-in speakers, which doesn't bother me in the slightest, but just something I thought I should highlight. The volume setting instead over here is linked to the 3.5mm headphone jack, therefore meaning that if you have got any sort of audio being routed through via HDMI or DisplayPort, then you can adjust the volume via the 3.5mm jack output. So there we have it. Hopefully you've enjoyed my detailed overview of the AOC Gaming 27G2ZN3. I'd be curious to know what you make of it down the comment section below and how you feel it compares with some of its competitors. Now, if you have enjoyed this detailed video, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.